Rak offshore company registration is popular with people seeking tax efficiency in a relatively stable jurisdiction. However, this is usually a poor choice. Rak offshore company registration warning. Rak offshore company registration is increasing in popularity. Unfortunately, so are the bank account opening challenges for these entities. For this reason, it's important to understand your banking options before moving ahead with Rak offshore company registration. The overarching concern, of course, is that banking options for most Rak offshore companies are extremely limited. In fact, most owners are now forced to accept subpar EMI and fintech solutions or restructure their company entirely in another country. Of course, as always, there are rare exceptions. In this video, we're going to help you navigate the banking options if you're considering Rak offshore company registration. We'll also highlight common challenges you'll face as well as some other alternatives you can consider instead. But first, if this is your first time visiting GlobalBanks, be sure to download our free business banking starter guide. It's designed to help business owners find and open accounts for their international companies in top banking jurisdictions. First things first, what is a Rak offshore company? Before diving into Rak offshore company registration, let's agree on some common language. First, Rak offshore companies are actually called Rak ICC companies. For reference, ICC stands for International Corporate Center, which is the corporate registry in Ras Al Khaimah, which is itself one of the Emirates in the UAE. As we'll discuss, Rak ICC companies can be used as international business companies, IBCs, or as holding companies. In this video, we'll be using the term Rak offshore company to represent all of these activities. Rak offshore company challenges and limitations. Like other offshore structures, Rak offshore companies are not allowed to conduct business within the country of registration, in this case, the UAE. Additionally, Rak offshore companies cannot engage in certain regulated activities, such as insurance or reinsurance, either as an issuer or a broker. But these restrictions don't tend to bother most people. Instead, where most people considering Rak offshore company registration get stumped is when it comes time to open a bank account. So, is it possible to open a bank account for a Rak offshore company? Well, the simple answer is yes, it's possible. In fact, it's possible to open bank accounts for pretty much any structure. But the real questions are, 1, where can you realistically open accounts? And 2, will that bank account actually be useful, cost-effective, and at a bank that actually meets your business banking objectives? Unfortunately, business owners with Rak offshore companies today are often left with limited options or feel forced to accept subpar EMI and fintech solutions. Using alternative banking solutions such as an EMI or fintech have obvious drawbacks when it comes to transaction fees, foreign currency conversion costs, safety and security of deposits, access to SWIFT, online banking, cards, transaction volume restrictions, and more. It's also important to recognize that the UAE is not a signatory to the Hague Convention. This means the procedure to authenticate corporate documents is more complex and costly for Rak offshore companies. Even if you're just trying to open an account at an EMI or fintech abroad, you'll still need to submit authenticated documents. This often comes as a surprise to entrepreneurs. Furthermore, while most people think that they'll be able to open bank accounts in the UAE for their Rak offshore company, that's not going to happen. Like many countries, the UAE has introduced economic substance requirements, ESR, which makes it nearly impossible for non-resident offshore entities to bank in the country. Another downside is that the perceived reputation of your business may take a hit. For instance, if you ask clients or suppliers to transfer funds to a digital platform, that doesn't exactly scream credibility. Plus, some international banks will refuse to send outgoing transfers to fintech platforms. So, that's something to consider as well. The bottom line is that in most cases, Rak offshore companies have limited banking options these days. And Rak companies have far fewer bank account opening options than offshore companies from other, more established jurisdictions. Rak offshore company registration benefits. Now, despite the banking challenges that I just mentioned, Rak offshore company registration can offer some limited benefits to the right type of business and business owner. So, let's take a look at those now. Benefits of Rak offshore company registration. Useful for companies with limited, zero banking needs, no corporate reporting requirements, exempt from taxation, including withholding tax in the UAE, can be registered with one shareholder and director, low-cost registration and maintenance, Privacy. Rak Company info can only be accessed by licensed service providers. Of course, benefiting from these factors hinges on whether a Rak offshore company can actually carry out the business that you're involved in. And if you need a bank account for that business, chances are you're going to face some serious challenges along the way. That's why it's important to stress that Rak offshore company registration should only be considered for businesses with limited banking requirements. Such businesses may include entities that are registered for the sole purpose of holding intangible assets, such as intellectual property or trademarks. Alternatively, Rak companies may also be used for holding real assets, such as property where the owner does not have any intention in receiving income from rentals. If your intended business falls into one of these categories, Rak offshore company registration may be worth considering, though in most cases, better options usually exist elsewhere. Rak offshore company registration and banking. Now, let's talk about bank account opening options. The first important note, if you decide to move ahead with Rak offshore company registration, your options are going to be severely limited. In fact, if you have a Rak offshore company, you should expect one of the two following scenarios. 1. Open an account with an EMI or fintech. 2. Make a significant deposit to incentivize the bank. However, if you are setting up a Rak offshore company for business purposes and/or you choose to use Rak offshore company registration simply because it's a low-cost option and lets you operate tax-free, those two scenarios probably aren't in your game plan. So, what should you do instead? Well, there are still a few banking options available for Rak offshore companies. However, these banks can be challenging to access and they tend to be very cautious about onboarding Rak structures. In other words, many of these banks won't entertain applications from businesses involved in high-risk or even moderately high-risk industries. The other alternative, which many entrepreneurs end up doing, is restructuring their business in a more acceptable jurisdiction. This is a practical choice for a few reasons. First, even if you can open a bank account for your Rak offshore company today, it doesn't mean that the account will stay open long term. Additionally, as compliance increases and AML and KYC rules get stricter, it's inevitable that your non-resident business will come under greater scrutiny. Second, Rak offshore companies are not as well known as other types of UAE companies and other offshore entities from other countries. So, Rak companies will often attract more scrutiny and eyebrow raises from bankers and compliance teams both during the application stage and after the account is opened. Basically, assuming you're opening a bank account outside of the UAE, Rak offshore companies stick out like a sore thumb compared to other company types. Alternatives to Rak offshore company registration. Now, when it comes to choosing where to register an offshore company, there are several factors to take into consideration. Unfortunately, most corporate service providers skip over these factors since it could delay your decision making or result in you going to a different country altogether. And that means they wouldn't profit from you registering a company. It's a similar story when using local bank introducers for opening accounts. Introducers don't offer you the best account opening options around the world. Instead, they just push banks that they have the best relationships with, which isn't helpful and isn't what most people need, but more on that in a little bit. The factors to consider when choosing a jurisdiction include everything from tax efficiency, bilateral agreements, public versus private registries, the cost of registration and maintenance, perceived and actual risk, reputation, and of course, which banks you can realistically open with if using that structure. With this in mind, it's often wise to choose more established jurisdictions that have a long history of company registration, that are widely used, bank compliance departments are familiar with, and have access to multiple bank account opening options. These jurisdictions can sometimes seem more expensive up front, but when you take into account the time, effort, and costs associated with opening new bank accounts, you'd actually be surprised at how inexpensive these jurisdictions actually are. Jurisdictions and structures that many entrepreneurs look at when considering Rak offshore company registration include BVI business companies, Canadian limited partnerships, Cyprus private companies, Estonian private limited companies, Hong Kong private limited companies, United Kingdom limited liability partnership, and United States limited liability companies. Now, this is obviously not an exhaustive list. Instead, it's just a few examples of structures that entrepreneurs often consider when trying to determine the best jurisdiction for their international business. And of course, each of the options I just mentioned has its own set of pros and cons to consider, including a varying range of bank account opening options. Depending on your business and personal profile, you may only be able to open accounts in certain countries. In other cases, banks around the world will welcome you as long as you can pass due diligence and meet deposit requirements. So, how can you open accounts for offshore companies? If you haven't already gone ahead with Rak Offshore Company registration and you want to understand what banking options are available, you can obviously use the information that I've shared in this video. Or you can access one of our account opening services and start taking action today. Each of our premium services are designed to help non-resident individuals, foreigners, and their businesses open international bank accounts. Whether you need personal, private, business, offshore, or even US banking, we have an account opening solution that will work for you. You can get started with GlobalBanks IQ, our international banking intelligence service. It gives you step-by-step instructions and all the tools you need to find and open accounts with top banks around the world. Plus, you'll unlock our international intelligence reports, account opening strategies, international bank database, and much more. We also have a dedicated US account opening service called GlobalBanks USA, which is 100% focused on helping non-residents, foreigners, and even foreign and offshore companies open bank accounts in the US. It involves direct one-on-one support from our team of experts and includes access to our US banking intelligence reports, US account opening strategies, and US bank database. And of course, there's our flagship service, GlobalBanks Insider. With GlobalBanks Insider, you'll get access to everything we offer, including all of the benefits in GlobalBanks IQ and GlobalBanks USA, plus our entire library of premium reports, the entire GlobalBanks database, and dedicated one-on-one support from our team of international banking experts to help you find and open the accounts you need. So, no matter where you're looking to bank in the world, you're only a few clicks away from finding and opening international accounts. To get started, just click the link in the description below to learn more about the available options. And before signing off, don't forget to hit subscribe so you get alerted every time we share new banking opportunities. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.